right, good afternoon or good evening. What I'd like to speak with you about today, I want to give the town board an update on the CCF, or Continuum of Care Facility legislation, and the ALF, Assisted Living Facility legislation. I'd like to give you an update because at this point, the planning board has given a positive recommendation on both of those items in a town-wide sense, and meaning in the implication of these laws in a town-wide fashion. The reason I'm giving this interim update is because ultimately, if these laws go forth on the Metropolis Golf Course site, there's the prospect for a CCF. So I want you to know that if this process goes town-wide and becomes affected, there's the prospect of that Metropolis recommendation also. That's a subsequent planning board recommendation, but we're kind of doing it incrementally to make sure that the town board's good with the direction this is going from a local law perspective, and then we'll focus on the site later. So I'm going to try and give this to you in a town-wide sense, and the implications town-wide of both of these pieces of legislation. Couple reminders. CCF, Continuum of Care Facility, and this is for those that are watching it TV who might not have been aware of this legislation, is a new proposed use that would combine assisted living and independent senior living. So that use is defined as those two uses in one building, right? Presently, there's no enabling zoning ordinance that allows a CCF in the town of Greenburgh. So that's, and that was privately petitioned by an applicant, and they privately petitioned because they have the desire to build one of these facilities at Metropolis Country Club. So they approached the town board, and that legislation or petition for zoning text and map amendment was referred by this board in July of this year. And as I mentioned, the planning board reviewed that and granted a positive recommendation. I will tell you the planning board had a lot of discussion on this. In fact, they met in July. They met in August. They had a site visit in September at the country club there. They had another meeting in September. They met in October, and they met in November. So a lot of moving parts here, but I'm going to give you the most pertinent aspects of the proposed legislation.
Jared, I don't remember whether I asked you this question when it first came up, because on the other site, the old St. Mary's property, which is now where the nursing home is, they also had adult daycare. And in this legislation, is it taking that into account as well?
Sorry, are you referring to the site up in Valhalla,
yes.
On Grasslands Road?
Exactly.
Yes. That use, apologize for all the acronyms, is a CCRC, Continuum of Care Retirement Community, only one of 11 in the state. That combines independent senior living, assisted living, and then skilled nursing or nursing home. So those are three components that make what's called a CCRC. Those are enabled in the town. When I say CCF, it doesn't have the way to distinguish it, it does not have the nursing home component.
But the adult daycare, they had it. I don't know whether it still exists.
They have it at that site at one time, or maybe they still do?
Yes, they did have it.
Right.
I don't know whether they still do or not, but there is a need for that as well. And I was just wondering if we're putting together this type of floating zone, that we also consider that. Because
I will report back to the board on that. I'm
okay.
not sure if the state regulates that through assisted living, whereas it's, you're not there necessarily for 3 weeks or 3 months or 3 years. But I would like to get back to you on that. I apologize, I'm not sure how that would interplay in the context of the CCF. So I will absolutely get back to the board on that.
Okay, because I know that there is special legislation for nursing home, and for adult daycare.
Adult daycare.
Right, and there are two types. There's a medical model, there's also a social model. And so it would really be good for us to look at that, because the need is there. And I know that many years ago, there was very, very little of it. So I just think that we should have the option available in case we need it.
I will check back, and right across from Town Hall, Center Light, I believe. Do you feel that that may be the use that you're describing as adult daycare. I can check into that as well. I'm just curious. It's in the OB
There-
district.
Right, there is some adult daycare around, but I was just thinking in a facility like that, because sometimes what you can have, if you have independent living, and you have one person who is mobile and can get out, where the other person may need some care during the day, and it can be done through adult daycare.
Got it. Oh, absolutely viable use. I will check back. Thank you.
So just for clarity, so adult daycare is exactly what it is? You go for the day and then you leave and you go to your personal home at? Okay,
Correct.
I just wanted to be-
Correct.
Okay.
Right, I know, so, like, in Mount Vernon, Wartburg has one of these full complexes where they
have
provide.
that at Knowles also.
Do they have it at the Knowles?
And that's what you had mentioned, right, up on
Yes.
Grasslands Road?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but that was for a larger piece of property. I don't believe that this is asking for as large a piece of property.
Right.
So I just think it's something to consider, because those are the various stages that people need help, and they may not need full care, to be in a facility. They might not be ready for assisted living, but they can, or families just may choose
Yeah,
to do that.
Viable use, we will absolutely check it out
Okay,
and
great.
make
Thank
sure
you,
we're
Garrett.
codified
I
properly.
couldn't remember if I'd asked you that.
Yeah, you may have, so I'll make sure I get on it. A little more background on the CCF for the board as a reminder and for anyone else watching. The CCF, which was privately petitioned, they reached out to us, they reached out to the board for comments about how to approach it. And if you recall in the comp plan, there's a policy with respect to assisted living facilities that said the town board should definitely consider a minimum separation distance from these uses. And the policy was based on a concern that too many of the uses clustered close together in the single-family districts could change the character of the residential districts in a negative way. So being cognizant of that, obviously in the comp plan, we relayed that to the applicant. And that indeed made its way into the petition. So there was this 4,000 linear foot requirement that a new CCF could not be within 4,000 feet of a similar facility, right? So I think it's very good for residents to understand, or important for residents to understand, that the genesis of this law, we went into it with a very conservative approach, right? So this 4,000-foot linear distance separation, and we have mapping, I think the best way to describe it is it really limits the pool of available sites in the town with that neighborhood character protection in mind.
Provided they don't get a variance.
We did discuss that, and I wanted to understand how that works. And this is a good question, because it's going to help me give more details to describe the CCF. The CCF is proposed as a new zoning district. So what that means is for one to have a CCF enabled in the town, as this Brightview applicant has done, they petition the town board. We have a site that we feel is viable for a CCF. We're not looking for a variance. We're not looking for a special permit. We would like to have the site rezoned to CCF. We feel it's viable for these reasons. It meets the criteria that are laid out. If the town board agrees, and you've made no decisions on Brightview Metropolis, but this is the process we're in, if the town board agrees, that site would be rezoned, and then they could come in for site plan approval. The way the variance works in this instance, I think, is actually very good in terms of discretion and control for the town and the town board. There really is no variance process. So when I indicate that one of the major criteria of a new CCF would be that you cannot be within 4,000 feet, which is, almost a mile, of another like facility, if you are, you're essentially not eligible for a CCF. So then the question is a great one, well, can I just get a variance? My answer from a process and planning perspective is no, that's not how it works. You would first have to get the town board to, well, first off, the town board would have to support varying the rules, if you will, and allowing a site within 4,000. So you have that initial line of discretion. So really, if the town board felt that the site should not be within 4,000 feet, you would essentially just convey to me, which I would convey to an applicant, that no, the rule is 4,000 feet. you know, the town board's not interested, and, you know, if they wanted to meet with you in work session, you could tell it to them directly. But there's no process for them to say, Garrett, we don't want to deal with your town board. Set us up with the ZBA so we can get a variance. That's not how floating zones work. There's actually no legal mechanism for that. So,
Have you checked that? Because it's a dimensional quantity, right?
Yes.
That's in our zoning ordinance, and the zoning board is charged with waiving or reducing or considering.
yes.
Having the
dimensional-
discretion.
We did check that,
Their
and
experiences.
as part of the due diligence through the planning board process, we sought the input of an independent professional planner, and this gentleman, David Smith, who I think you've met on one or two occasions on other matters, met before the planning board and opined on the function of a floating zone, and actually walked through that whole process and the dynamic with, can you apply for variances, can you not? And yeah, he is around, and we'll absolutely have him come in at any time you want, and that may be the public hearing, it could be another work session, but he absolutely confirmed that. And I think the main,
He's from New York.
yes, he is Yonkers-based, he does consulting for Sleepy Hollow, and
Has
he,
somebody tried and a court ruled that they couldn't, or is it based on what he thinks the law says?
I can look into case law, but here's one reason I think I may sell you on confidence in this issue. Ultimately, you cannot apply for a dimensional variance for a use that you are not able to even utilize in that zone. So when I say that the process for a CCF would be to apply for the, let's say, the single-family zoning that exists, to have that removed and replaced with the CCF, in essence, your question to me is, can an applicant not apply for the zoning for a CCF, which is the only way to enable that use, and go to the zoning board with the underlying zoning single-family, which says you cannot do a CCF? Essentially, my answer to you here today is that would be a use variance, and I suppose you would tack on the dimensional variance. So you're talking a use variance, which we all know is essentially,
I'm talking about they do parallel. It's not that they do one and just, you know, on a hypothetical, go for variance on something they're not applying for, but they actually apply for the floating zone at the same time they apply for the variance, similar to as you apply for a special permit use and you apply for variance.
I guess
you
my
waive the special permit condition.
I understand what you're saying, and I think my answer to that would be, I would advise the town board in that scenario to either abolish the 4,000 rule, because you see a real-time example that you support, and maybe you would in the future, who knows? But at this point, with the best knowledge that we have and trying to take a protective measure, we are advocating for a 4,000 recommendation, but I would actually say a town board would have to go into that knowingly saying, yes, we so support this. This is a very unique application. If you do get the variance, do know that we'll concurrently float the zone on there. So I think that's the
My
planning
main point,
consideration.
my
Yeah.
main purpose of asking these questions is I don't want to make a statement that we can't live up to.
Right.
Because we know some significant variances have been given in the past, and we have to live with that.
Yeah, so we all want to be on the same board here procedurally, and what I will do is I will take this excerpt and I will circulate it to our legal staff and Dave Smith as well, professional planner, and say, hey, you understand this stuff, did I describe it correctly? Because that's the last thing I want to do. I'm giving you my best knowledge, but your questions are great, and there's certainly things that we should all be thinking about.
Just as an FYI, the county put together a housing needs assessment, a very thorough housing needs assessment. And actually, they broke it down according to all the 45 municipalities in the appendix and what their needs are. But the one thing that sticks out in my mind is that the largest growing population, and I don't know whether it necessarily applies to Greenberg per se, is the elder population. So it is a larger percentage of our population that might dictate some needs, especially for independent and aging in place considerations. So just keep that in mind.
One of my concerns, with this application, which I discussed with you earlier, is I feel Dobbs Ferry Road is, because I bicycle on it a lot, I feel that it really needs a sidewalk from 119 to Norwood, if you have, you're going to have employees who may not have access to cars. They may be, you're going to have senior citizens who are going to want to go to you have you have the shopping center, Crossroads, you have where Acme is. So I really feel that since this is discretionary, that we should send a strong message to the applicant that, in the past, we've gotten developers to pay for sidewalks. I think that this would be something that they should, absorb. The other thing that, I think that we should ask for is, I formed a committee at the beginning of the year to look for more affordable assisted, living facilities, because, these facilities are, could be like $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 a month, which is very, very expensive. The Chelsea is giving discounts to, to residents. I'm sure, this facility will also give discounts to residents, but there's some people, even if they give discounts, they're still not going to be able to afford the discounted rates. And when I met with, the applicants, because they've been part of the committee, they said we could, pass a law that would require, say, a special fund to be created. So let's say there's a resident who can't go into an assisted living facility. We could provide almost like a scholarship for home care, services. So we would set up a fund, and it may be, I'm just throwing out like a number, it could be $4,000 per bed, just like.
It wouldn't be a scholarship.
Not a scholarship, it would be basically a fund.
Some kind of funding stream.
Yeah, and this was their idea, not mine, but it's a way where we can make this a benefit for people in the community who actually can't afford, will never be able to even come close to affording this.
That's why adult daycare can be very helpful.
Right,
Because-
that's what I was just thinking.
Because when people are working,
Right.
that person that needs care can be taken care of.
Yeah.
So that
And
they
it's
can
not
live
as-
at
And it's
home.
not as expensive. It's not that it's not inexpensive, but it's not as expensive. But if they have social models, they're less expensive than medical models.
And the
So-
thing to think about in terms of that is some kind of way to provide transportation back and
Yes.
forth to the adult daycare.
Yes, you're right.
My concern about this is that it's already a very densely populated area, and the proposed building is enormous. It's as big as the building that is, as big as the Chelsea, right, as you described to me. That's a very, very big building that's going to be put in an already very densely populated residential neighborhood. And I'm concerned that the number of trees that they're going to take down and that they're going to stick this enormous building, in that small space, already heavily densely populated, I think it's just going to be too much, for the neighborhood. So that's really my concern. I don't necessarily think that it's appropriate there for those reasons.
Okay, these are all good comments. Definitely, I was going to touch on affordability a bit. You made some good comments there. As far as the actual Metropolis site, without a doubt, the sidewalks are an absolute important component that we'll push for as much sidewalks as reasonable. As far as the very specific question about, you cut right to the chase, at least for this applicant's interest, and there's no reason to dodge that discussion. I think that, there was a site visit, there were some neighbors there, and some of those neighbors, I gave my card out to, and I said, please, I want you to know about the process, and in subsequent meetings. So I think ultimately, as this unfolds, I want to make a promise that we're going to do our best to, beyond what the code says about mailing, X feet around of notices, we're going to do everything we can to make sure those neighbors are aware. This site, I would say just a couple things to react to that. The one side, it's more than half is bound by the golf course itself. Across the street is a office building that's non-residential, and a bit to the west is, you get towards the Norwood Shopping Center. Just on a straight, like percentage-wise, immediately adjacent to the site, You know, it's not 360 surrounded by residential homes, and I'm not discounting your opinion there. Just some things that jump out at me. And ultimately, I think, you know, if the applicant were here, they would say, we're cognizant of the fact that there are absolutely homes that are very proximate to the proposal, and they would, you know, identify that there's proposed landscaping, and, you know, so I think that.
Yeah, but they're taking down tall, premature trees, and they're not gonna put them back. It's gonna change
Right.
the whole way that the street looks and feels. It's a narrow road. I appreciate the fact that there's a strip mall across the street from it, but that doesn't mean we should further denude the neighborhood and take away all of the attractiveness that still exists in the neighborhood.
Can I ask, I'm wondering if it would make sense, say, at the beginning of the year, to do what we did with, you know, the shopping, the supermarket, and maybe invite residents who live in the immediate area to join the town board as we're reviewing the project, and we do a site, you know, visit, and we show people exactly, you know, the area, so this way everybody, you know, in that immediate community will know exactly where it is, because they'll be present there. And then we could also discuss, you know, all the concerns that, you know, people have. You know, we could discuss the sidewalks, we could discuss, you know, like you know, everything, and everybody will be at, you know, this way, everybody.
Similar to what the planning board did.
Right, and this, you know, the developers will ask for the sun, the moon, and the stars, because they're really, ultimately, what they're in it for is to make money, so they're going to want as many units as they can possibly get. But if there is, you know, that's a negotiation. If they're building fewer units, if you know, if we have some sort of greenway that will retain that character, you know, there are many ways to look at it. And I think your consideration is very important, because that is key, not only for the aesthetic, but for water, for flooding, for everything else. And, you know, making sure that they implement other flood remediation practices and infrastructure.
So in terms of the process, you know, the planning board, you said had a positive declaration. How many more steps do we need, you know, before, from now till, let's say, an approval or a rejection is voted on?
Yeah, so actually, I'm glad you raised your concerns there, because I actually now am going to transition. I think I would have a different answer for you, but I think it is important that on this site, that we do get an understanding. If the town board collectively feels that this site is not appropriate, then I think we would have to revisit the CCF legislation and perhaps consider it a floating zone that cannot be done in single-family zoning districts. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but I just want to be able to react properly to, you know, the collective of the board. I would say that process-wise, I think based on what I'm hearing, and that's kind of why I'm here, right? Because I will tell you, these documents take a long time, and a lot of thought go into them, and, you know, I have a lot of things to work on, and I want to be most efficient in my role here. But based on what I'm hearing, I think the applicant should actually get in a work session with the board and maybe get a little more site-specific, but I think you'd want to hear from perhaps the local civic association and residents, and if that's best done in the board's opinion through site visit, then by all means,
I think it makes sense.
I would be happy to coordinate that.
I'd like to do a site visit and a work session, because I feel that a site visit will give us sort of like a little better appreciation exactly where it is, and, you know, exactly what's going to happen. It's more visual, and, you know, right now, you know, everybody's talking, oh, you know, it's the country club, and I bet you 90% of the people have like no idea exactly, you know, where it's going to be, you know, located. The other thought that I have, just in response, you know, to your concern, you know, I'm not saying I'm for it or against it, but I also think that we should be aware that Elmwood went out of business, and a lot of country clubs all over, you know, the nation are going out of business. So in some ways, you know, one of the, you know, when we're weighing the pluses and minuses, if we say no to this now, 10 years from now, the whole country club may go the same way as Elmwood, because they may not have the funds, and they may be doing this to basically stay in business. On the other hand, if we you know, so if we say yes, it may give them an opportunity, it may enhance their chances of surviving, because if they go out of business, the same thing's gonna happen to Metropolis as happened to Elmwood. They're gonna sell it, and you're gonna have a lot more, housing and a lot more, tree cutting, later on. And I'm just saying that's something that we should keep in the back of our mind.
What might be instructive, because another concern, of course, is the traffic, right, and all the cars on the road, is in similar, if there is any studies done, because I've got some observational impressions in a similar type facility that's independent and assisted living units that's in Ardsley, that the residents are very few actual drivers, that the people, many of the people who work there take public transportation. So I think that there can be a lot of fear of what people imagine might happen, and knowing having some sort of study of other facilities, and if there is any kind of assessment to be able to calculate based on that knowledge, or it would be helpful in calculating based on that knowledge.
Yeah, all that
Impacts.
information is helpful, and that's certainly, part of that has been done on the record. And also, in this specific instance, the applicant, they intend to go forth and do site distance studies from the proposed driveway at Metropolis, and I think they want to get an understanding, right, whether or not, generally the board is interested in this application, because they haven't done the final level of transportation detail, but they have done a significant amount. But I do think, do we think a site visit with the town board and the applicant, and we'll invite residents out, is the next step that you would advise?
I think that would really make
That's
sense.
a good idea.
And then maybe a follow-up
Maybe
work
you could pick like
session.
a snow date or something, because if we're going on the
Exactly.
property, maybe 3 snow days.
And it should be, when the applicant was here, they talked about, the street adjacent to the property being those neighbors that they reached out to. I think it needs to be much more broader than that, because more people in the area are gonna be impacted by it than just those few people whose homes abut the golf course.
Understood. No, good points, good points. And I will tell you, they've had some discussions with the Civic Association, and
The Juniper Hill Civic
yes,
Association?
yes. And one of my action items to the applicant would be to meet with the Juniper Hill Civic Association. As far as other civic associations, because again, this is legislation that has townwide implications, I do feel it's really the town's responsibility to get the other civic associations and residents townwide educated. And I was actually going to recommend to the board, if you would object to me reaching out to the Council of Greenberg Civic Associations and walking them through, because I think on many levels, one of my punchlines here was that the way the legislation's crafted with these rings, it really does severely limit the pool of available sites. And when you look in yellow, a majority of them are almost like infeasible, and these are sites outside that are the minimum acreage that is specified in the petition. And just quickly going through them, you've got Prospero, which is a thriving nursery, and one would hope that they continue to thrive and do what they do. Another is the Camp Mohawk, and what I just said about the nursery, I think we can all say about them as well. This yellow down here is Edgemont Middle School. It's actually, it's publicly owned. I don't see them public-private partnership to do this, but I just just to show sites that are at least 6 acres, that's on there. This is a cemetery. It's very misleading. That should go away, or a church, I believe. There are 2 sites on 9A that are in the GI district.
What's GI?
General Industrial down in the Ardsley, on Sawmill River Road. So we did take the approach townwide that this is not going to open up a flood of availability. And on that level, the planning board liked it. They actually thought we were too conservative. I will tell you, the planning board likes the rings, but they would like the rings to only apply in the single-family zones, to give the protection to the single-family zones. But they gave an example of, let's say, Siemens off of Benedict Avenue. If that site were to go vacant, which again, these are just hypotheticals, it's a great business, and, you know, they employ
Right.
many people, let's hope that never happens.
Let's not start rumors.
Sorry to say the name, let's just say Company A that's over here off of Benedict, tucked back in that location. They gave the example that if that site went vacant and was vacant for years, and they said, well, if you did a CCF there, in our opinion, at, you know, a faraway look, it probably would impact no residents from a noise and traffic perspective, and I tend to, a far look, agree with that.
Glenville Woods people would beg to differ with
They
you, I'm
may,
sure.
they may, but the site is tucked back, and it's very
It's right up
sizable.
against Glenville Woods, though. There's one street that Siemens parking lot is right up against.
That is true. But they're just saying, at least for the purposes of where our legislation should go, the planning board feels that if you didn't apply the rings to non-residential zones, it at least makes it eligible. And again, if you hear from Glenville Woods and the site were proposed too close to there, you have the discretion to say no. So the planning board likes the discretion of the floating zone and the discretion it affords the board. Therefore, they did not see it as important to have all these limiting factors, knowing that ultimately the discretion's there amongst the board. So there's two different directions that the law could take, and I don't need an answer tonight. I
Right.
just want you to be aware of the dynamic there.
Could we set
So,
some,
wait, just want to ask one last question, if I may. Distinguish this from the legislation that we crafted for assisted living facilities, where we bent over in a similar fashion to make sure that there were only certain areas where this was going to be applicable, and then we had the Shelbourne come along and get a variance and end up in a place that we were positive there was not going to be an assisted living facility, that we specifically made a determination that it would not be there, and all of a sudden the residents of Edgemont are faced with the Shelbourne. What is it that makes this legislation different that would stop that from happening now with this?
So,
I think that's
That was
Francis's
my
concern, too.
point.
oh, was it? Oh, okay. Sorry,
I didn't use the name. I didn't use the name. That is exactly what I was saying.
okay, I'm gonna go.
Anyone has some
Right.
interpretations?
I didn't mention a 3,000% variance, but.
So I'm here to answer your question. And it's a good question. And I actually was going to get into this a little bit. When I tell you that part of what I came here today is the CCF, I also came here for the ALF. With the assisted living facilities, the way it presently works is not a floating zone. It's a use by special permit in the one-family residence districts, right? In our comprehensive plan, it says, consider for assisted living facilities introducing an additional special permit criteria that puts in this 4,000 linear separation. We were cognizant of concern of over-proliferation. So I was going to come to you with that, regardless of what this CCF was happening, but it just seemed good timing, right? That was done as a protective measure to further protect the single-family neighborhoods. I will tell you that when the planning board understood the CCF and the way it would function and the way the floating zone would function, the planning board liked the discretion built into the floating zone so much so that they recommend, and it's in here, that the assisted living facility as presently enabled in our zoning ordinance be modified so that that special permit rule in the single-family zones goes away, and that assisted living facilities function in a same floating zone manner. Now, if that were to happen, you may like that. If you asked me, does that afford us as the town board more discretion about where these sites go? I think I would say absolutely. That's the planning board recommendation. If that's the direction this goes for assisted living facilities, I think I've already answered that question as far as the level of control you have of this, the sites going somewhere. You'd have to approve it on a site as opposed to variances or anything else. Do you understand that concept?
yes.
Now, to get more direct about, if we look back in history about what happened before, ultimately, what I would say is the assisted living facility, when it was enacted in 2010, 2011, it had the special permit. It had a rule that said, a zoning, a criteria of special permit that said a site must be within 200 feet of a state road or be accessed, I forget the exact language, but you understand. We did, as staff, identify sites that were 200 feet from state road. there was a minimum 4-acre criteria. That was part of the criteria that we used to help map. And we mapped all 4-acre sites that were at minimum 4 acres and within 200 feet of a state road. And the Shelbourne site clearly is not within 200. So we didn't map that, and I've said this before, but you don't, from a planning perspective, map sites that need variances, because ultimately, you could essentially map every site in the town, and it becomes, so an applicant, by New York State, you have zoning ordinance, you have rules and regulations. Applicants do have the right to apply for relief based on whether they feel there's, unique characteristics to that site, and all I can say is that's the process that unfolded, and yeah, so that's a kind of, I hope I answered your question. If I didn't, please let me know, but,
So does that, so let me just clarify then. So
Sure.
that means that with this legislation that we're considering now, because we have the ultimate discretion to say no, there isn't the possibility of getting a variance if we say no.
yeah, I would agree with that, and,
That's the question he's gonna research.
and I'm gonna recheck that.
Am I repeating you? Okay.
Yeah. And, if you recall, there was a site off of Payne Street a couple years ago. It's a triangular-shaped site that was over 4
Yeah,
acres.
absolutely.
An applicant came to this board, and they met with you all, and they wanted insight into whether you would support an assisted living facility on that site. I will tell you, it was not 200 feet from State Road. It was, I don't recall the exact amount, but it was quite a bit more. Let's just say over 1,000 feet or something like that. It was accessed off of Payne would have been accessed off of Payne via 2 dead-end streets. And if you recall, the message from the town board at that time was, we just really can't see this happening. It doesn't, you're gonna access an assisted living facility off of 2 dead ends, despite the fact they said they will loop the dead ends. And it just was clearly not something the town board supported, and if you asked me, was the town board right in everything they said, I would say yes. I would have said the same, from a planning perspective. If right now, the process for assisted living, yes, they could come in for a variance in that instance for the 200 feet. If the ALF flips to a floating zone, that same applicant would come to you and ask for the zone to be floated, and you could say, we're not interested here. We don't think it's appropriate for a site to be located off of 2 dead-end streets and, off of Payne. Yeah. I will tell you not to throw too many curveballs in here and give you too much information, but I don't want to overload you. But it's important. The planning board in their recommendation also weighed in on the 200-foot component. And the planning board felt that while, yes, state roads have mass transit, in general, more accessible from highways and things, they felt that state roads are not the only roads that are heavily traveled and appropriate, potentially appropriate for these types of uses. With respect to the 200-foot provision, the planning board recommended that that be reworded, and I want to go ahead and read direct from what their recommendation was. They generally said, let's lose the 200-foot rule and have it, here, let me just read it direct. The planning board recommends updating the 200-foot rule as a favored policy. The planning board recommends replacing the 200-foot state-county road proximity requirement with a standard that ALFs and CCFs must have reasonable access for emergency vehicles. So again, the planning board feels that both uses should be floating zones.
Reasonable is not a quantifiable.
No.
Right, so the way that would function, what does reasonable mean? Ultimately, that's your decision. What would contribute to that? You could use your own personal knowledge. You could receive information from staff. We would send an application out to the local fire district. We would send it out to the police. You gather all that input, and if you feel that access is not reasonable, then that would not be a site that you would float to. But I'm just letting you know, I'm not saying that's what you should do or shouldn't do. That's what the planning board
But
opined.
ambiguity goes to the applicant.
So
When they're weighing it, ambiguity goes to the applicant, not the town.
okay, right.
So we gotta work on that.
Okay, but that's just a recommendation. Otherwise, the floating zone, as petitioned and as conceivably could be proposed, would keep the 200-foot provision. And that's an eligibility standard for a floating zone, okay?
Could we have set, like, say, a tentative date, tried, say, doing the site visit, say, I'm thinking Saturday, January 17th or something?
In the snow? No,
Say it's gonna snow?
what do I know?
Yeah. And maybe you could call
That
that.
would be interesting if it does. That would be interesting if it does.
I can absolutely
Then
try
maybe
and
if it
coordinate that,
snows,
yeah.
we'll do
He's
it
been
the
reading his
following week.
farmer's almanac.
Well, what I'm thinking is we could have a work session, and then also, I mean, we could even meet here, and then, maybe what we should do is meet here, and then go to the site for the people who want to go to the site. Would that make more sense?
I think it would be helpful if they make a presentation here as to what we're going to see, then we see it, and then if necessary, we come back and discuss it, because it's very difficult, particularly in the winter, to have any kind of a discussion out.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay, so then maybe we could do.
Okay, so start here
Well,
at
then-
Town Hall
then we-
Saturday, like
Then
a
do we
Saturday
want to
morning.
do it like on a weekend, or do you want to do it on, if we're not going to really do the site visit, then we could use a GP,
I think the planning board, when I went with the planning board, I think we did it on a weekend. Well, Garrett, was that a weekend?
I think that one was actually a weeknight, but they're routinely done by the planning board on weekends.
That's when I thought it was done.
It's probably
want
better
people to
done
be
on
home.
a weekend because the days are so short during
Right.
the week.
Right.
Can't really see.
Okay.
And you want people to be home,
Right.
right, so they can come and visit.
Rich,
Yeah.
you can't do it at night.
Right.
When it's dark. I
Come
mean,
out.
Or it's
Right.
4
It's
o'clock.
dark at 4 o'clock, exactly, and it feels like it's night.
which is the 17th, and a snow day.
Saturday, January 17th, what time would we start this here at Town Hall, would
Maybe
you
like
imagine?
11.
Okay, 11
Yeah,
a.m.
could we do it a little bit later? I have other commitment on Saturday morning.
Noon?
Noon,
Or
12:30
1
is better.
o'clock, we could do.
12:30.
We do one?
One
So
would
let's
be
just
great.
do one.
1 p.m.
Yeah, one.
And then, okay, with a potential snow date one Saturday after, you're saying?
The following, I guess, will be the following.
In case the weather's bad.
Probably be doing it.
Great. I did intend to invite the applicant here, and I know your schedule, as it was a week or two ago, was rather packed, but then things freed up, so that at this point, that's why I just gave the update.
Yeah, we said that it would be like a 5-minute discussion.
Yeah.
The other thing is, do you have any estimate in terms of the tax revenue to the school district, the fire district, and the town?
We took a look in 2018 at what the Brightview Straight Assisted Living Facility generated, and I think it was roughly like $530,000, so however that's broken up proportionately. And that's with that them being fully occupied. So as, for comparative purposes, that's the best
So
info I
really,
have.
for the school, the Greenberg School District, you're talking probably at least $250,000 a year with no kids.
Well, you don't know that. I mean, they're saying that that's going to be the case for the independent living, but we don't know that.
No, right,
And
I'm
they're
saying
likely
that's-
going to be condos, unless we have condo legislation
No, I'm talking about
to
the,
deal with new
right.
condos.
Oh, I see what you,
So, I just don't want us to make statements that may not be accurate.
okay, that's fine.
Well, thank you for your time.
So you'll,
It's
and
very
you'll
helpful.
confirm to
That
everybody.
was a great 5 minutes.
Great, very good.
Garrett, you were
Long
going
as
to talk
5
about the
minutes
affordability.
I was, yes, thank you. Right, as Supervisor mentioned, the previous assisted living facilities, there's nothing in the code that designates a certain percentage of set-aside units for affordability, and I don't think that's at a fault of the town board legislation. I do believe that it's not a simple type formula where straight multifamily housing, for instance, you can do 10% of units. I think when you talk about assisted living facilities, it's very complex. I know there's very different cost structures for how residents enter, and, you know, at advanced ages, incomes are not necessarily, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe this. I believe sometimes there's instances where people will essentially essentially give their life savings and have zero income. There's whole kinds of formulas that people are able to stay in these facilities. So I don't know if it's a one-size-fits-all, 5%, 10%. So what's occurred in the past is, as the supervisor mentioned, applicants have said, well, we can do 5 units at 20% reduction in rate for eligible residents. I will tell you, the county doesn't have a formula. I know you put together a committee, and I don't know that there was a definitive statement that, well, you know, every assisted living facility should be done in this fashion with regard to affordability. But having said that, the present local law does not mention affordability with respect to ALF. The recommendation from the planning board is that it's absolutely important, and that while they don't have an answer either to say 5%, 10%, 20%, what they said was, at a minimum, the zoning ordinance should specify that applicants should provide the levels of affordability that they can work within their model and income requirements and things like that, and put the onus on that applicant. And that's something that you would, I guess, weigh. So when one comes in for a floating zone, if their answer to that question is we don't care about affordability, we're going 100% market rate, you may be more apt to not float the zone on that site, because that's an important thing. Or if they come at you voluntarily with something that you say, wow, this is exceeding anything we've ever seen here in the town, you know, they'll score points in that regard.
And the
So,
Chelsea is actually making an effort to provide some discounts, because I've been in touch with them like very, very frequently.
same thing with EMS provisions. The present ordinance does not specify that you have to have, for instance, a 24/7 LPN or RN. But as you know, the board has conditioned that take place. What's being recommended in the new law is not that, again, you be very specific, or that the town says you have to have 1, 2, or 3 LPNs or RNs, but what is recommended is that there be questions posed as part of the legislation that the applicant would have to answer about things like lift policies, the presence of 24/7 LPN, RN, or other mechanisms that will minimize the work that our EMS providers
Could
do.
we,
So these are all things that we're thinking about in building it into the legislation, as opposed to relying on conditions of approval. So we're trying to be proactive.
Could we basically state, because we've gotten, during previous hearings, they say, there could be 100, calls, say, a year or whatever. Could we say anything over a certain number of calls, they would have to reimburse the town? Because my feeling is that, as part of their taxes, they may say, okay, well, the ambulance, the police will handle it, but if it gets excessive, and we can have like a minimum, then they should, for example, pay for a police headquarters. There could be some sort of.
I don't think that's a good idea,
There could be
Paul.
some sort, you like that?
I think what you're suggesting is already built in. There is a cost per trip that's built in, so.
They would reimburse, they would.
No,
But-
that's already
but what-
occurring.
what
That's already
would be
occurring for
considered
transport.
Over and above, I mean, yeah, Chief, do you?
I don't have a number for you, but, sorry. But as you know. Good afternoon. We only bill for transports, but in speaking with Brightview, they have a built-in mechanism for lift jobs, so to speak, where they have staff on duty to assist with those lift jobs. Someone falls,
Right.
that they're not injured, that there won't be tied up police resources to come, or fire resources. But for our billing purposes, we bill the Medicare, the soft bill, and we reimbursed for that. You know,
But I
If the
those are
fire
programs.
But I
district
guess
isn't
the issue
reimbursed,
is, if you
right?
get so many, what kind of pressure is it putting on
Yeah.
the EMS people in terms of answering a call somewhere else, because there are too many calls, and so there's got to be other ways to, to recoup what it's costing. I think that's really that's a bigger issue. And I think what we're trying to put in the legislation are those that were not lifting their patients up if they fell, and they were waiting for the police to come in, or the EMS people to come in and do that. And there were some places that were actually doing that.
I could get you, do some numbers for the board based on existing calls for service for the last several years, may be helpful to you to,
Right, I think that
for your,
we could
for
get
your,
a chance to look at that.
yeah.
Okay, that would be great.
So
I
I
believe
just
the
have-
applicant,
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. Go ahead, Judy.
No, the question that I have here, so we keep saying that it's assisting living. So where's the assistance coming in at if they don't have anyone on site to assist them as they're living there? Am I missing?
Well, I think that's what
This
what I
is
was going to
just-
say
yeah,
was, I
this-
believe this applicant, the applicant said that they would not, that they would lift people. They will lift.
Okay.
So in that sense, that one part of assisted living, they will do, which is the part that tends to impinge upon EMS and police.
But I would
The
think that they would
rest-
have something on, people on site.
Not always
Personnel
20
on
No,
Always.
hours.
see,
Not always
assisted,
24 hours, Gina.
So just to
Yeah.
clarify,
Yeah.
assisted
Okay.
living facilities are regulated through New York State, and there are minimum requirements of personnel that have basic life support and training, basic
Okay.
training with
Okay.
regards to caring for the population. What we're saying is, like, as an example, the town has went over and above that and required the presence of a 24/7 registered nurse, right, which I think is a good thing. And that is going to ensure that there's a greater level of care on site, right? And what we're saying is, we're actually gonna go so far as to codify that and not say that you have to have it, but let us know if you're going to have it. Let us know if you have a no-lift policy. If someone comes to the town and says, we're not gonna have a 24/7 registered nurse on site, we do not lift residents, we call 911 every single time. I would expect the town board to weigh that heavily, and that may not be the right provider for the town of Greenberg.
But they likely will not say that. They will say they will lift, and then they don't.
Well, no, whatever they say they will do is a condition of approval that
Right.
has to be adhered to, or they go through the fine system and penalty system.
Right.
And essentially, their CO could be conceivably revoked for health and safety reasons. So I do think there would be strong mechanisms to ensure enforcing what they say they would do.
Is that like when people say they're gonna have this gorgeous landscaping, for Westies or some other property, do we ever go after them to take their CO when they don't? And
Well, I
that's-
think it's all a scale of what the mitigation is. I don't know that we would immediately seek to yank a CO over a few, dead trees or something like that. But we do check up, and we do have mechanisms to try and enforce that.
I'm just
Let's
suggesting
not
that we
poo-poo
have
the
a-
dead trees,
Right. But
The
right?
trees are important, I'm sorry.
the other question I have, if you have a 24 unit and you having one RN on site?
Some of them don't have, they don't even, some of them don't even have that.
Okay.
Well, 24 hours?
So so then we come back to affordability, so I'm paying $10,000 a month to live at a place where I won't have assistance, or I won't even have someone that may be able to.
If you need assistance at that level, they expect you to have, and you have a permanent aid. They give you help within the facility to do certain things, but if
Okay.
you have someone who has specific needs, that there are those where they have 2-bedrooms apartments, and an aide actually lives there with that.
That way you would pay separately, that would come in.
That you
Yes.
pay in
On
addition to
top of
what,
the
yes,
$10,000.
exactly.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a lot. On top of the
But,
$10,000, then you pay another rent.
Gina,
That's a lot.
assisted care is,
Okay.
it's helping, it's feeding the residents. It is helping them with bathing. It's helping them with giving them medications in some instances.
in some places.
So there are all kinds of levels of, someone who's in assisted care isn't necessarily sick.
Right.
They're just
They just,
have some issues,
Well, I
that's
know
all.
somebody
Or they're in
who was
wheelchairs,
in an
or,
assisted living, and it was the end of their life, and the woman that, her mom, they were paying over $20,000 a month.
But again, these facilities are regulated by the state. You have to have a license to do that. So it's not the town who's regulating that. It's a state operating license that permits them to do that, and I'm assuming they're regulated in some way.
But there's also, a lot of the assisted living facilities are going to be seeking the state legislation, the state laws where there is some beds that could be much more affordable. And a lot of assisted living facilities are applying for, some of those, beds, so they could create more. I forgot what it's called. I think it's I forgot the terminology, but, they all, I think, are
I think that's so
seeking
they
that.
can accept Medicaid.
Yeah,
I'll see who's.
So
Is it-
the whole idea of this continuing care, as I understand it, is you go in starting with independent living, which
Okay.
may be condos.
Okay.
Then at some point, you need assistance, so you go into the assisted living.
Yeah, okay.
And at some point, you've advanced to the point of you have memory care, and so
Okay.
there's a memory care.
Okay.
And so.
A nursing home, they have medical professionals on staff and more than just one nurse for a quantity of people. But, you know, what happens is, now I'm speaking from personal experience from
Right.
my mother, but living in independent living or assisted care, you know, someone might fall or have an
Right.
incident. So a nurse is there to check blood pressure, check to make sure there are no bones broken. But they're not there providing actual care like you would envision in the hospital.
One-on-one.
I guess still in my mind, if I'm looking at 24 units and they're just, you know, you and I just older, just need a place to stay, and you have one nurse. So what if, can something happen to you at the same time as something happened to Diana? That, the stress and the pressure, and again, maybe that's not our concern or our worry, but I'll be concerned if I'm gonna put my mother, which I'm not mine in case you're listening, I would, you know, I would be concerned if, you know, you only have one person able to handle or take care of things that may come up. You know, things do come up. So that is
Yeah.
the
They have
concern.
they have
Statistics
they
on
have
the
other
staff,
aides.
the staff ratio, so they've given us, for
Right.
instance, they have
So,
24
okay.
full-time staff
Okay,
over
that's
3
what-
shifts,
that's-
but we can
okay.
get that info for you.
It depends on
Not
the
everyone would be a
kind of
RN
care that they
necessarily.
need to.
And I'm just saying, like, even
No,
you
no,
start
I
to get
know.
old, like now, you know, as I get older, you know, I fall or sometimes you want someone on. You think about a school, even little kids, how they fall and stuff, you know. It's amazing you have one nurse, but now I see it's grown, but that's just.
All right, so just to keep us
Okay.
focused
Oh,
on the
sorry.
agenda.
Yes.
So I understand there's going to be a site visit sometime in January.
Yes.
Is there anything else that you wanted to discuss with us?
No, I think this is a great conversation, and thank you for your time.
That was
No,
what,
thank
your
you.
third or fourth 5 minutes?
Yeah.
See you all next year.
I was going to say, at least.
now we'll spend 5 minutes on the budget.
Agenda review, I think.
Okay.
Which is next on the,
I thought we had, are we doing the procedure for the,
yeah. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about the public hearings that we have for tomorrow, because I know we have about 5 or so.